Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 35. As always, if you have questions that you want answered on the podcast, send them to Michael at scientifictriathlon.com or through the Facebook Messenger widget on scientifictriathlon.com. Big thanks to Precision Hydration for sponsoring this episode. We've had some heat waves coming to Lisbon recently with temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius, even as I record this in mid-May. And that means that I am particularly careful with getting enough electrolytes in, both during workouts, during long rides, for example, but also after workouts, so that I recover properly, as sodium replacement and hydration fluid replacement is part of that recovery process. And to actually retain all the fluid that you consume post-workout, you need to have enough sodium. Otherwise, you'll just pee it out afterwards. So sodium is a critical part, and electrolytes in general, of your hydration and recovery status. So go and take Precision Hydration's free sweat test on precisionhydration.com to learn more about how you sweat and how much electrolytes you lose in your sweat. And you can use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box or tube of Precision Hydration electrolytes for free. And thank you to Roka. There is one final chance now to enter the Roka giveaway. It's open until Sunday, May 26th, coming up here. So this is the last chance, really. And what you can do is you can win an entry to any Ironman race in the world, plus a Maverick X wetsuit, which is the fastest flagship wetsuit model that Roka has, and plenty of runner-up prizes, including buoyancy shorts, R1 goggles, transition backpacks, etc., to take the total of value of the prizes up to more than $2,000 of prizes up for grabs. Go to roka.com/TTS, of course also linked in the episode description, and enter the giveaway to win the Ironman race entry and Roka Maverick X wetsuit and plenty of other prizes there. All right, let's get into today's first question, which is from Martin in Wales. Martin writes, I have a question about lactate threshold. I've had a VO2 and lactate test done by my old coach. My VO2 was 60.2 and my lactate threshold heart rate was 145. I assume that it was heart rate here, by the way, and not power. It doesn't say, it says just lactate threshold, but I think it's heart rate. Martin writes, however, he uses 5 millimoles as the point at which to take this reading from, and everything I'm reading and hearing is that it should be 4 millimoles. Is this okay? Will this make a huge difference to the results, and should I adjust my zones because of this? All right, so thank you, Martin, first for your question. It's a good question, and it's not that there is no specific lactate value that should be taken as your lactate threshold. It's not 4 millimoles, it's not 3 millimoles, it's not 5. Or I should say that for some, it's 4, and 4 is a good average value. Like on average, that will probably be close to the truth. But for some people, the lactate threshold occurs at 3 millimoles of lactate, and for some it occurs at 5 millimoles per lactate. So it's not about what the value is, it's where that lactate curve the lactate concentration starts to increase exponentially. So it's no longer a linear increase in lactate with intensity. And you can go to episode 79, which is an interview with Alan Cousins. In the show notes for that episode, which I'll link to, it's scientifictriathlon.com/TTS79. There's a figure that shows the anaerobic threshold, which is sort of equivalent to your lactate threshold. The terminology is always a bit confusing, but that's the way it is. And there you can see basically what is meant by this and how to find that point where your lactate threshold actually is. So again, hopefully your coach actually looked at your individual lactate curve and determined that for you, 5 millimoles is where this inflection point happened. And that's why your lactate threshold, 145 beats per minute, it corresponds to a concentration of 5 millimoles. But up until that point, your lactate was increasing linearly and not exponentially. So it would be correct for you. And I hope that is what your coach did. And I just have to assume that that's what he did. And if this is the case, then the zones that you should have received are based around this anchor point, your lactate threshold, and also the first inflection point, or LT1 as that's sometimes called. So hopefully that is what happened and you don't need to change anything, but check with your coach how he did that just to make sure. Because if he just picked 5 millimoles and that's basically a blanket number that he uses for everybody, then that's not correct, and you don't want to use those values. And in that situation, you really want to look at the actual lactate concentration curve and determine your anchor points, your LT1 and your LT2 from those different inflection points that happen on the concentration curve. Just briefly about the zones that you'll set. When you have your first and second lactate inflection points, so LT1 and LT2, LT2 is the one that is often referred to as simply lactate threshold. Then there are several methods, of course, of creating training zones based around this. But in general, your low intensity training should be below your LT1, and your high intensity training is above your LT2. And your threshold training is, in terms of heart rate, it's basically from, let's say, your lactate threshold heart rate -8. So if it was 145 for you, your threshold zone might be from 137, 138 or so, up all the way until your threshold heart rate 145 beats per minute, maybe even a couple of beats higher, at least if you do longer intervals or longer continuous segments at this sort of heart rate. So that is basically how you can set your heart rate zones and get to know what your heart rate means at different intensities. Martin's question has a second part, which is another question which is affecting me right now. I'm into my final 3 weeks of marathon training and starting to taper, but I've picked up a little virus and feel like I'm coming down with something. What is your recommendation at any stage of a training plan if you do become ill? Should you rest completely just to do easy miles or carry on as normal? Obviously, I'm now panicking that if I do rest and take time off, I won't reach my goals in the race. All right, so my take on this briefly is that if it's something light, like a light normal cold, and you don't have any serious symptoms, you don't have headache, you don't have fatigue or fever or chest pain, then I recommend training lightly. So maybe you shorten the workouts. Maybe you don't even need to do that, but you keep it low intensity, very low intensity, just ticking over until the illness passes. Otherwise, if you do have symptoms like that, you have fatigue, like serious fatigue from the illness, or you have chest pain, you have fever, then definitely take time off, rest completely until you're recovered. Training through it is not going to help you. It's only going to hinder you. You're not going to recover as quickly. Your body is already working on overdrive to fight off that virus. So training is only going to be detrimental. And I know that it really sucks being ill, but sometimes an illness forcing you to take a few days off can be a blessing in disguise, actually. Sure, the first few days, once you get back to training, you will feel lousy and you will feel like you lost all of your fitness and it was all for nothing. But then you actually do notice, maybe a week or so after being back training, that you are that much fresher and you start to perform a lot better in your workouts. That recovery really helped you get to a new level and absorb the training you did before. So it can be a blessing in disguise. So don't panic. It will all be fine. Thank you, Martin, for your question, and very best of luck in your upcoming marathon. The next question for today is from Guido from Brazil, who writes, "Hi, Michael. I have a question about setting training zones after performing a lab test that I hope you could help with. I did a 12-minute ergospirometry ramp test on a treadmill, running, increasing both speed and incline. Both Garmin and Training Peaks use % of lactate threshold for setting up the training heart rate zones, but the test I took only provided anaerobic threshold, VO2max, and respiratory compensation point. I read on a couple of websites that I could use anaerobic threshold as the lactate threshold. My questions. 1, is this statement true? I'm kind of suspicious because they measure different things." Okay, so I'll answer this part of the question first. Thank you, Guido, for your question. I think looking at your question, because you also sent your test results, that you mean that the test provided your aerobic threshold and respiratory compensation point and VO2 max, and not anaerobic threshold and respiratory compensation point, or RCP. Because in ergospirometry tests, what we measure is two thresholds, just like in lactate testing, as per the previous question. So then I talked about LT1 and LT2. They are the two inflection points on the lactate curve when we measure lactate. And in ergospirometry, those inflection points are instead based around your ventilatory threshold. So they're called VT1 and VT2. So the ventilatory threshold 1 and ventilatory threshold 2. But just like in lactate testing, we use different terms for LT1 and LT2, and it gets all confusing. When the test is based on ergospirometry, gas exchange, then we use some other terms as well. So quite often, respiratory compensation point is used as a term for VT2, so that's second threshold. And aerobic threshold, by the way, anaerobic threshold can also be used for that second threshold. And instead of VT1, ventilatory threshold 1, we can use the term aerobic threshold. So I think that you sent your results, and you sent your VO2 max was 51.5, and then it says AT, which it says 55% of VO2 max at 135 BPM and 11.9 kilometers per hour. And RCP, respiratory compensation point, 89% of VO2 max, 164 BPM and 16.9 kilometers per hour. So based on this, I think it's very clear that AT here is your aerobic threshold. It's VT1, and VT2 is that respiratory compensation point. Because it's clear based on the percentages of VO2 max that this is what was measured. So you have your VT1, which is the 55% of VO2 max, 135 beats per minute. And you have your VT2, which is your 89% of VO2 max at 164 beats per minute of heart rate. So what Training Peaks then and Garmin means with lactate threshold, that is that LT2, which corresponds fairly closely to VT2, which means that for you, since your test provided respiratory compensation point RCP, which is the same as VT2, that means that the RCP is what you should be using as your lactate threshold, quote unquote, in those softwares. So your question, is this the same? No, it's not technically the same, because they're measured with different technologies, with lactate concentration versus respiratory exchange ratios. But for practical purposes, they can be considered the same, yes. So you still use, they're still going to be very, very similar. If you go and do a lactate test, you'll get a similar result. It's not going to be the same, but it's similar enough. And they're the same anchor points. VT1 and VT2 correspond fairly well to LT1 and LT2. They are the physiological anchor points around which something starts to happen, something starts to change physiologically in the body. So those would be equivalent anchor points for your training zones. But it's just important to be aware that they're not, since they're measured with different technologies, they're still going to be slightly different. So if you go and do a lactate test, you can't, and you see that your speed at LT2 is slower than it was than your speed compared to your speed at VT2 with the ergospirometry test, you can't really compare that, because even though they are similar, they're not the same. So you need to do apples to apples comparisons. The same thing if you compare to a friend or something like that. You really need to make sure that the testing method is the same if you want to really compare, do a fair comparison of results. And actually, this also goes for the testing protocol, not just the methodology. So if you do a lactate test or an ergospirometry test, whether you do 3-minute ramps or 5-minute ramps makes a big difference, and you're going to get different values if you use 3-minute stages compared to 5-minute stages. Same sort of thing if you do a lactate test or a VO2 test outdoors on the track compared to doing it indoors on the treadmill, that is going to make a difference as well. So there is no black and white threshold or magical exact number. It's more like a range around a certain point. So that's important to be aware of, and the testing protocol is going to have an impact on that. All right, so the next question that Guda has is, what's your consideration about this protocol? Are there better ones to perform? Well, it's difficult for me to tell because he only told me the total duration and that it increases in speed, which it of course should. It's a ramp test, and incline, but not by how much it increases the speed and how long the stages are. The one thing that is that I'm not clear on is why they would increase the incline. That is a concern that I have with this protocol. And actually, in the results you sent me, it says that at your VT1, the aerobic threshold, the incline was 0%, and at the RCP or VT2, it was 1.2%. So it wasn't a big increase in incline, but I'm not sure why they would want to increase the incline at all. The way that I would prefer, to be honest, to just have a set incline that is either 0% or a 1% incline throughout the test. And maybe the 1% would be ideal because that would correspond the best to your paces outdoors, because otherwise your paces on the treadmill might be a bit faster than the corresponding paces outdoors would be. So then, but now I guess the disadvantage here with having different inclines is that you can't really set your speed zones, or I guess you can't compare the speeds from the first to the second ventilatory threshold and set your speed zones based on those two anchor points. You actually need to choose one or the other, probably the RCP, and then set your speed zones based on that, which isn't ideal. I would much prefer that they would have had one set incline, but it may be that I'm missing something and that they had a perfectly fine reason for doing so. But in general, ergospirometry in general is great. It really is the gold standard of testing, since it's the only way that we really get information about running economy, which I hope that this lab should be able to give you with the data that they have from the test. So you should ask them to get that running economy data as well. And also, depending on how you measure it, you can get into substrate utilization. Then it becomes even more valuable. So how much carbs and fats are you oxidizing at given intensities? So it is a great test, ergospirometry in general. You get a lot of information that you can't get from pure lactate test. You can't get running economy, and you can't get substrate utilization. So it is great from that sense. I mean, the ideal thing is that you also take lactate samples when you do the ergospirometry test, and you get the best of all worlds. That's really the ideal situation. Otherwise, the one major issue with many lab tests is that they, for financial reasons, they try to use as short stages, as short ramps as possible. So usually 3 minutes, which can be a bit too short in many cases. And I think it's much better to use 5-minute stages, or at least 4-minute stages for each speed. But that is the way the world works. So I would always encourage athletes to ask their lab that they go into to do 5-minute stages and nothing shorter than that. But I don't know here how long your stages were, so I can't comment on that really. The last question that Guda has is, can I use the same results for cycling with or without adjustments, or should I perform another test on using a stationary bike? So this is a quick one. Yes, you do need to perform a separate cycling test to get specific information to be certain about your results. That is definitely my recommendation to do that. However, if you choose not to do that, or you're not immediately ready to do that, maybe you want to save up some money or whatever, then what I would recommend that you do is that you use your running heart rate zones, and you can subtract whatever the difference is between your peak heart rate for running versus cycling. So let's say that your peak heart rate for running is 190 beats per minute, and you know that for a fact. That is the maximum heart rate that you can get up to while running. And you know that your peak heart rate for cycling is 180. So then just use your running heart rate zones minus 10, and that can be a good proxy for your cycling heart rate zones. But keep in mind, this is a proxy. It's not exact. And I would recommend at some point getting in and doing that separate test on the bike as well. Thank you, Guda, for your question. Final question for today is from Miguel, who writes, Hello, Michael. Hello from Mexico, Michael. First of all, thanks for the great content you present each week. It's always good to listen while training. Definitely one of my favorite podcasts. A friend of mine has recently bought a human hex sensor, and based on your recent podcast about polarized training, I was wondering if this device can be used to perform a sort of metabolic test in order to find the right intensities to train, something equivalent to VT1 and VT2. I have also seen that once you set the human data field in a Garmin watch, you can see hemoglobin concentration and hemoglobin percentage readings. Can you please elaborate on how these readings shall be interpreted? Thanks a lot and keep bringing great content to the triathlon community. All right, Miguel, thanks a lot for your question. This will be a fairly brief answer. I don't have any personal experience with the human or other similar devices, but I have talked to some very smart, very knowledgeable people who do. And Steven Seiler, I don't remember actually if it was in my conversation with him or if it was in some other podcast that I listened to, but I know that he has said that unfortunately devices like the human aren't at the moment accurate enough to be useful in practice. You essentially get led down a false trail. And more specifically, I remember talking quite in depth about this topic with Chris Myers, who was a guest on the podcast back in episode 112. And I'll link to that episode. We talked about periodization. So Chris is a coach, but also a researcher, and he has been researching this topic, used a lot of the technology that is behind devices like the human, which is called NIRS. It stands for Near Infrared Spectroscopy. And this technology is basically, it's emitting light of an infrared wavelength into the muscle tissue. And then it sort of measures the reflection that you get back. And based on that, it can calculate the oxygen saturation and other things that the human devices and others measure. The thing with this technology is that the technology itself is good, but in its current implementation in devices like the human device and the Moxie as well, I've interviewed the founder of Moxie before on the podcast. The implementation in devices like this is nowhere near accurate enough for it to be useful for us as athletes, which is a shame, of course, because it would be great if it were, but that's the way it is. And this is Chris' words, not mine. And it's not because the technology doesn't work. It is a great technology used in some great medical device applications, which I know of very well because of my background in medical devices. But in an athletic setting, the device needs to be very small, light, and wearable. And this is where the challenges arise. It becomes very difficult to implement technology that can accurately measure these sort of subtle changes in that with those constraints on the device that we have as endurance athletes. Basically, the infrared light doesn't necessarily get deep enough into the muscle tissue. That's, if I recall correctly, where Chris said that the main issue really is, so that we do not get accurate enough data on this. If you want more information, excuse me, if you want more information, I think that Chris would be happy to talk to you about it. Just look him up on the Peaks Coaching Group website and send him a message, because I know that he was very passionate and interested in this topic, and we discussed this quite at length after, not in the interview, but after the interview with him, we discussed this topic. So the recommendation from me to you would be to, unfortunately, I would not recommend using the human or other devices at this point for the purposes that you suggest. Thanks anyway for your question, and it's really good to get this information out to the bigger audience as well. That wraps it up for today. I'll link in the episode description to the episode 79 that I mentioned for looking at how lactate concentration curves should be used to establish LT1 and LT2. I'll link to the episode with Chris Myers. That was episode 112, and I think that is it. Maybe I'll link to something else. You can see it in the episode description. If you have questions, keep sending them in, and keep sending in a lot of questions like general training, swimming, biking, running, strength and conditioning, nutrition, race strategy, and execution. I think I've been getting a lot of questions about training zones and heart rate and lactate tests and lab tests recently, which is great. But I also would appreciate getting like a big variety of questions. So basic questions around, for example, swim, bike, and run training would be perfect. So there are plenty of questions that haven't been asked yet. So I'm just sitting here waiting for you to send them in. So anything that comes to mind, feel free to start typing away and click send. One other thing, I want to start to give some shout outs more often to training plan users and maybe coaching clients. And today I want to give a shout out to Erin in South Africa. who wrote an email to me saying, I bought your plan to train for my first ever sprint distance triathlon, which I completed over the weekend. I last swam freestyle at school 5 years ago. I knew how to cycle, but I had never trained in cycling or done a cycle race. I was completing 5-kilometer runs in air quotes in a time of 40 minutes. I came from a strength training background with very little cardio workouts included in my gym routine. Now I just did my triathlon in a time of 1 hour 54 minutes and I'm totally blown away by this. I can't believe that I finished and in a far better time than I could have predicted. Thank you for your plan, Michael. It definitely helped. I don't think I could have done this without it. Congratulations, Erin, on a fantastic achievement, not just the race, but actually going through the whole process of consistent training for a race is the biggest achievement, I think, especially when training for your first race. So really, really good job there. And thank you for sending through that email. I really appreciate that as well. You can check out the training plans on scientifictriathlon.com on the training plans page. There are quite a few training plans up there, and I try to add more when I have time to create more. There you can find plans from beginner sprint plans all the way up to Ironman plans for more intermediate athletes. I haven't yet created my advanced athlete plans, but the intermediate really means even if you are a 10, 30, even 10-hour Ironman athlete, you can do pretty well with those intermediate training plans, I think. So advanced would be really quite advanced when I do create them. So there's a range of plans to check out. Big thanks finally to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test and use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box or tube of pH for free. And thanks to Roka for sponsoring the podcast. And remember that this is your last chance to enter the giveaway on roka.com/TTS. It's linked in the description. And rather than paying hundreds of dollars for your next Ironman entry, you could get it for free by entering that giveaway. So do that, take the chance on it, and let's hope that you win. It's open until the 26th of May. That's on Sunday. So time to enter now. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.